Good morning, and thank you to all of you for being here as we discuss the new Pew survey on attitudes towards paid family and medical leave, as well as actual experiences with taking up paid family and medical leave. My name is Aparna Mathur. I'm an economist here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm also the co-director of the AEI Brookings Project on Paid Family Leave. You might have been following our blog series. My co-director at Brookings is Isabel Sawhill, who's also going to be moderating the first panel. And over the course of the year, we've been exploring the issue of paid leave as it relates to the birth of a child, leave for own illness, taking care of family members. And the issues we've been looking at are who has access to leave, who doesn't, why does it matter, and what would we hope to see in a federal paid leave policy. I think the critical thing here is that there is very little information so far on the actual experiences of people with leave. We have seen a few surveys at the state level, for California, which is the state that has had paid leave programs for the longest time. And I think what we generally feel is, yes, they've done a lot better. People in these states are doing better than under a system where they only had access to unpaid leave. And yet they're still struggling. A lot of people still say that we're unable to take the full extent of leave because it doesn't come with job protection, or the amount of wages we get paid when we are on leave isn't enough for us to feel comfortable taking those 6 weeks off as is allowed in California. And so I think the Pew survey is filling a critical gap in our knowledge about how are people dealing with the current system of paid family and medical leave in the US as a whole. What are the experiences of people nationwide? And also, what are the attitudes towards paid family and medical leave? We see a lot of questions about what's the impact going to be on workers? What's the impact on business? Why should the government be stepping in and trying to solve this problem? And so it's interesting for me to have people from Pew who've done sort of a much larger scale survey and tried to figure out how people feel about these issues and what has been the experience with them. So to begin with, we will have a brief presentation of the Pew Report by Juliana Horowitz and Kim Parker from Pew Research Center. And that discussion will be moderated by Belle Sawhill. So I'll just introduce them briefly. Following that panel, we will take a 5-minute coffee break and then have a second panel on which we will actually have a much larger scale discussion about how these policies are working out in the US. So Juliana Horowitz is an Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. She's involved in all stages of the research process, including designing and managing major survey projects, developing questionnaires, analyzing polling data, writing reports, and presenting survey results. She has conducted research and written on various social issues, including racial attitudes, cross-national views of gender equality, and the changing American family, and has worked actively on the Center's US politics and global attitudes research efforts. Before joining Pew Research Center in 2006, Dr. Horowitz worked at the Center for American Politics and Citizenship at the University of Maryland. Why don't you guys come on stage? Kim Parker is the Director of Social Trends Research at Pew Research Center. She oversees research on emerging social and demographic trends, manages major survey projects, and writes and edits reports. She was previously the Associate Director of Social and Demographic Trends Research and the Research Director for the Center's political unit. Before joining Pew, she worked as a research associate at AEI. This was in the 1990s, so welcome back. Belle Sawhill is a Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. She served as Vice President and Director of the Economic Studies Program from 2003 to 2006 and was previously co-director of the Center on Children and Families alongside Ron Haskins. Before joining Brookings, Dr. Sawhill was a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget under the Clinton administration. And she's also co-directing, as I said, the AEI Brookings Paid Family Leave Project. So I'm going to let Belle take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aparna, and welcome to all of you. It's early in the morning, and I ran a 10K this weekend, and so I'm feeling like it's at least an hour earlier than normal. I didn't run it, by the way, I walked it. As you can see, I'm too old to run.
The best way to do it.
I'm really delighted that the Pew Group is here today to share with us their important findings. It's a great report. I had the opportunity to delve into it a bit on my plane ride back to Washington yesterday, and it's just chock full of really great information. So I don't know which one of you is going first.
I'm going to go first.
Okay.
Shall I go up to the podium?
Yeah, that'd be good. Thanks, Kim.
Sure. Okay, let's see. Okay, great. Thank you so much it's really great to be here. As Aparna mentioned, I started my career in Washington here at the American Enterprise Institute as a research assistant for Norm Ornstein. I was hoping he might be here today, but apparently he's getting on a plane in Miami and headed back here later today. I just heard from him. So we're really happy to be able to be here today and share the findings of this study with all of you. I just wanted to say a few quick words about the Pew Research Center in case you're not familiar with us. We're a nonpartisan fact tank located right around the corner. We inform the public about important attitudes, issues, and trends that are affecting America and the world. And the unit that Juliana and I work for is the Social and Demographic Trends Unit. And we study a whole range of issues, but some of the most important work we've done, I think, has focused on the family, gender, the workplace, and balancing all of those things. And so this work on paid family and medical leave is really a nice extension of the research that we've done in those areas. I just wanted to talk briefly about the study, how we conducted it. We did 2 surveys. They were both conducted online. One was a survey of the general public where we wanted to gauge general attitudes about paid family and medical leave and the different policy options and possibilities that are out there. And then the second survey was a very large survey, almost 6,000 adults who had either taken family medical leave in the last 2 years or had needed or wanted to but weren't able to. And so the findings of those 2 studies, I think, really helped to fill some important knowledge gaps out there on this issue. The general public study, we took a deeper dive, I think, on this issue than many of the other surveys out there have done. We sort of deconstructed paid leave into its various components, whether it's maternity, paternity leave, personal medical leave, or family medical leave. And we also looked at the intersection of paid leave with these broader issues of gender, the economy, the workplace, and in that way, I think we're able to tell a bigger story about the issue. And then, perhaps more importantly, the targeted sample that we were able to put together was so large that we could really look at people's experiences with these different types of leave. And we could also look at some of the key demographic fault lines and how those experiences differ, whether it's by gender, income, education, and there really are very sharp differences in experiences that Juliana will get into a little bit later. In addition to the surveys, we conducted some focus groups early on in the process in 4 cities in different parts of the country. And those were really informative in terms of helping us develop the questionnaire. And we also gained some really important insights from those focus groups, and those are featured in one of the chapters of the report. So now to get to some of the findings from the survey. Overall, we found that there's broad support for paid leave. Get to the first set of findings. There's broad support for paid leave, but it does vary depending on the circumstances that the worker is dealing with. So support is strongest for people who are dealing with their own serious medical condition. 85% of the public thinks that workers in those types of situations should be paid. And 82%, a very similar share, think that women should be paid when they take leave after the birth or adoption of a child. And still large, but a little bit less robust majorities think that workers, fathers who are taking leave after the birth or adoption of a child should be paid for that leave, and also workers who are dealing with caring for a family member with a serious medical condition. Think that those workers should be paid. So you can see there's broad support, but what this slide also shows you is that among supporters, most think that the pay should come from the employer, not from the government. Only about 1 in 4 of the respondents said that the government should be responsible for paying workers who are out on their own personal medical leave, and about 1 in 5 thought that the government should be responsible for paying mothers who are out on leave. And when you look at fathers and also workers who are taking care of family members, we found larger shares of the public saying that those workers should maybe be able to have leave, but perhaps it should be unpaid. So about 1 in 4 said that about people who are taking care of an ill family member. Now, interestingly, given the era that we're living in, this idea that employers should be responsible for paying is a bipartisan sentiment. We see that both Republicans and Democrats think that employers should be responsible for paying. You see stronger support among Democrats for a larger government role, but even among Democrats, majorities say that it should be employers that are providing this benefit for their employees. And that's true with regard to mothers and fathers on maternity and paternity leave, and also, as you can see, with workers caring for family members and also dealing with their own medical issues. So the patterns are quite similar there. We asked separately about whether the government should require employers to provide this benefit to employees or whether employers should be able to decide on their own. And on that question, the public is sharply divided. And not surprisingly, there's a strong partisan difference here. So 69% of Democrats think that there should be a government mandate, so government should require employers to provide this benefit, and only 33% of Republicans share that view. And we also tried to gauge support for some of the various proposals that are out there. Now, in this type of survey, it's virtually impossible to include all of the details and nuances of these complex policy proposals, but we did try to include some of the key concepts that are floating out there in terms of ideas that people have for a policy approach to this issue. We found that there's really no public consensus on the best way to deal with this policy, but we did find that there's stronger support among the public for programs that would incentivize employers or employees to save for themselves to provide this benefit, or things like tax credits where employers would get tax credits if they're willing to provide the benefit. We found less support for programs that would be more government-run, perhaps funded through higher taxes or new taxes on wealthy individuals or corporations, or a proposal that would pay for leave through contributions to payroll taxes from employers and employees, and then be administered by the government. It's important, another important point to make is that in a separate survey that we did in January in one of our political polls, we included the issue of paid family and medical leave among 21 other policy issues where we were trying to gauge how important each should be as a priority for the new Congress and President Trump to deal with. And paid family leave actually was at the bottom of that list of 21 in terms of policy importance. So while people really support the idea of expanding access to paid leave, in terms of policy priorities, it really doesn't compete with the economy, jobs, healthcare, and education, those other top-tier issues. So it's important in discussing this to keep that in mind. Some of the other issues that we addressed in the general public survey that have been part of the policy debate, we found that about 3/4 of the public say that both mothers and fathers should be included in any paid leave policy, whether it's administered through employers or through the government. And we found on that issue that Republicans and Democrats are largely in agreement. We also found that a very large majority, 85% of the public, say that if the government were to provide paid family and medical leave, that it should be provided to all employees regardless of income. So there was relatively little support for any kind of means testing on this type of benefit. And we asked about sort of more generally how different groups in society might benefit if there were universal access to paid leave. And we found the public, overwhelmingly thinks that families and women and men would benefit from universal access. The verdict on the economy is a little more mixed. About 2/3 say that universal access would be beneficial to the economy, but a significant share, about 1/3, think that it would have a negative impact. And then we have an interesting set of findings on employers and small businesses. And here you can see that there's sort of a mixed verdict on what the impact on employers would be if we were to have universal access. About half the public think it would be a positive impact, about half say negative. And then for small businesses, there's really a sense that it might be difficult for small businesses to absorb the cost of providing this type of benefit. So kind of a mixed bag there for businesses, but there's also some good news for employers who would like to provide this benefit. And the public thinks, pretty overwhelmingly that employers who do provide paid family medical leave to their employees will have a better chance of attracting and keeping good workers than employers who don't provide that benefit. So that was a really interesting finding. And we also found that a majority of the public thinks that employers can afford to provide this benefit without having to reduce salaries and other benefits that they provide. And here we did a little kind of experiment within the survey. We asked one form, half of the respondents, whether most employers could afford to provide this benefit, and the other half we asked about small businesses specifically. And again, we found a majority think most employers can afford it, but when it comes to small businesses, the public is pretty skeptical that they can bear the cost of this without it cutting into the other types of things that they're providing for their employees. And then just one more GP finding, and then I'll turn it over to Juliana. We tried to put paid leave in a broader context of different types of workplace arrangements and benefits. And we found here, I thought this was a really interesting finding, that the share of adults who say that having flexibility in terms of when they work their hours, the share that say that would be helpful to them or that is helpful to them is just as high as the share that say paid leave is helpful to them. So again, it's important to keep this in perspective, that paid leave is one of many benefits that workers say might be beneficial to them. And now I'll let Juliana talk some about the specific findings from the personal experiences.
So I'm actually going to start with some findings that are still in the general public survey, but I think they're a good bridge between some of the views on, particularly on paid paternity leave, but also in terms of explaining some of what we see with fathers and how long they take off when they, following the birth or adoption of a child. And so we asked in the general public survey a set of questions about gender and caregiving. And so one of the questions that we asked was whether mothers or fathers would be better at caring for a new baby. And while many Americans say that both are equally good, more said that mothers are better caregivers for new babies than fathers are, 53%. And here, men actually are more likely than women to say that's the case. But where we see that, but the big difference that we see really is when it comes to age. So particularly those who are 65 and older, a majority say that mothers, about 2/3 say that mothers are better at caring for a new baby. Whereas among those who are 18 to 29, the vast majority say that mothers and fathers are equally good. When it comes to time to bond with a new baby, the vast majority of Americans think it's equally important for babies to have time to bond with their mothers and their fathers, but about a quarter say it's more important for babies to have time to bond with their mothers. And again, here we do see not as much of a gender gap, but we do see a big age gap here too. And one of the things that we see is that these views on gender and caregiving are related to support for paid paternity leave, even when we control for things like age and gender and political ideology. And so those who have a more gender balanced view of gender and caregiving tend to be more supportive of fathers having paid leave, and even more supportive of fathers having leave in general, paid or unpaid. And then we also asked whether people think mothers or fathers want to take more time off, and here a majority of Americans, including men and women, and across ages, say that mothers want to take more time off than fathers. And so now I'm going to turn to the second survey that Kim mentioned, where we looked at people who took or who needed but weren't able to take family and medical leave. And so just to start with, we find that among those who are employed in the last 2 years, about a quarter said that during that time they took time off following the birth or adoption of a child, or to care for a family member with a serious health condition, or to deal with their own serious health condition. And one of the things that we find is that taking time off to care for a sick family member or to deal with one's personal medical issue is more common than taking time off for parental leave, which is interesting because a lot of the discussion around, particularly around paid leave, tends to center around maternity and paternity leave, but in fact, it's more common for people to take time off for personal medical or family medical leave. And it's important to keep in mind that these aren't mutually exclusive, so there are people who, during that 2-year period, may have taken time off to care for a new baby, but at another time during that period may have had their own medical issue or taken time off to care for a family member. And so we asked those people what their most recent experience was, and that's what we take them through in the survey. And then we also find that 16% of workers say that during that time, during those 2 years, there was a time where they needed or wanted to take time off for one of these reasons, but weren't able to. And that's particularly common among lower income workers. And so we find that 30% of workers with household incomes under $30,000 say that there was a time in the last 2 years where they needed or wanted to take leave but weren't able to do so. So they're about twice as likely as those with higher incomes to say that happened to them. For those who were able to take leave, the median length of leave for mothers on maternity leave was 11 weeks, and for fathers it was 1 week. And in fact, 72% of fathers said that they were back to work within 2 weeks or less. And here, when among those who said that they were married or living with a partner at the time and that their partner or spouse were also employed, we asked a set of questions about how they made a decision about who would take more time off. And physical recovery was the main issue, but other things that came up were things like who wanted to take more time off and who would do a better job caring for a new baby. So that's sort of the link back to those first set of findings that I presented, that if people think that mothers are better caregivers, and people think that mothers want to take more time off, and that's part of the decision, part of the factors that go into that decision about who would take more time off. But in terms of among mothers, again, those with higher incomes tend to take considerably longer leaves than those with lower incomes, actually twice as long. The median length of leave for those with incomes under $30,000 is 6 weeks, and then 12 weeks for those with incomes of $75,000 or more. And just real quick on the family leave and the medical leave, it's about 2 weeks. The median length of personal medical leave is 2 weeks, 2.1 weeks, and then 2 weeks for family medical leave. And in terms of the level of satisfaction with the amount of time that people can take off, we see that particularly among those who took parental leave, the majority say that their leave wasn't long enough. They went back to work sooner than they would have liked to. That's the case both among mothers and fathers. 59% of fathers and 53% of mothers say that they took less time off than they had wanted or needed to. There's more of a sense that the time was adequate among those who took family leave or medical leave, but still among those two groups, about 4 in 10 said that they didn't take enough time off, that they wish they could have taken longer. There are many reasons why people go back to work sooner than they would like to. Financial concerns are at the top of the list for people across incomes who return to work sooner than they would have liked. 69% said that they just couldn't afford to lose more wages or salary. But there are other things also that come up. For example, about half said that they worry that they might lose their job. And that's particularly the case among lower income workers. 63% of those with incomes under $30,000 said that that was a reason why they didn't take more time off. And one thing that's important to note too is that these patterns match what we heard from people who didn't take time off. So the reasons for taking less time off than you want to, or for not taking time off at all when you need to, were fairly similar. And again, financial concerns are at the top of the list for those who didn't take time off when they needed or wanted to. In terms of getting paid, we asked people first whether they got any pay during that time, separate from whether it came from a paid leave benefit or some other benefit. And what we find is that most leave takers do get at least some pay. And about half of them said they get their full pay while they're on leave. But here again, we see a very large income difference. And while those with incomes of $75,000 or more, a majority of them said that they got full pay, a similar share of those with incomes under $30,000 said they got no pay at all. And this reflects, at least in part, the different levels of access to benefits such as vacation, sick time, and paid family and medical leave. And so we asked people where that pay came from. And a majority of them, of the ones who got at least some pay, a majority of them say that at least part of that pay came from vacation days, sick leave, or PTO that they had accrued. And then about 22% of them said they got short-term disability. That's the case with mothers and for those who had their own medical issues. And then 20% of those who got at least some pay said that that pay, at least part of it, came from a pay leave benefit provided by their employers separate from vacation, sick leave, and PTO. And so that represents 13% of all leave takers, which is consistent with the figures that the government finds from employers through the National Compensation Survey. And many times people combine more than one benefit, and so we found particularly among mothers who take longer time off, they're combining vacation and short-term disability and perhaps and sick leave and other things. There are lots of different things that people do to cope for the loss of income excuse me, during that time. And here I'm focusing on parental leave because that tends to be the longer amount of time that people take off. And so part of what we find is that parental leave takers who didn't get their full pay across income say that they cut back on spending, and there's some other areas of commonality in terms of the different things that people tapped into and different measures that people took to cope with the loss of income or the wages or salaries. But where we find big differences are when it comes to taking on debt. We find the majority of parental leave takers with incomes under $30,000 say that they took on debt during that time in order to cover the loss of income. And we find that about half said that they put off paying their bills during that time or that they went on public assistance. And so those are striking differences that we saw across income groups and in terms of people's experiences. And we're on Twitter, so follow us.
Thank you. So much that's interesting here that I would love to discuss. Let me just say a couple things and then ask each of you a question, and then we'll open it up to everybody else in the room. I think it's very important to recognize the strong levels of support for paid leave in your work. You know, stronger amongst Democrats than Republicans, as you'd expect, but basically a majority in both groups. On the other hand, I was also really struck by the overwhelming support for putting the burden on employers. And interestingly enough, that is, I would say, not a consensus, or at least not a majority opinion amongst experts. And the reason is because if you put the burden on employers, and particularly if you mandate it, and I recognize there was a split there between those who wanted to mandate and those who just wanted to encourage, but if you're saying employers should pay for this, what happens? First of all, you're likely to get discrimination against potential women workers, because they're the ones that have the babies and are most likely to take the most leave. Secondly, you're probably going to get some trade-off with wages and salaries, which probably the general public doesn't recognize. And then finally, I think that the public did at least recognize that for small businesses, this could be a burden. And interestingly enough, in our working group, the one that Aparna and I have been leading, and some members are here today, and you're going to hear from some of them, we've had these same debates about what about small business and how should we finance this. Interestingly enough, none of the existing proposals in the political and policy arena for paid leave put the burden on employers. They all involve either a payroll tax system to finance leave, or tax credits to give an incentive to employers, or possibly reallocating some other kind of government spending like unemployment insurance. So this is an area where the public's views contrast sharply with both expert and policy views. I thought the finding about flexibility was fascinating. And it occurred to me that, and I think this is my question for you to think about, Kim, that maybe we're making a mistake to have these different buckets. You know, there's a bucket for parental leave, a bucket for your own medical needs, and then a bucket for taking care of other family members. And yet, if you look at the private sector, what most employers are doing is having a single bucket called paid time off, which is earned the longer you've been on the job, presumably, but is heavily tilted right now towards higher wage, higher salaried people. What would happen if we had a paid time off bucket that you could trade off between these different uses, but in which we made sure that lower income workers got it, and also that people weren't making, impossible trade-offs between, never having any vacation because they used up all their vacation time to have a baby or whatever. Anyway, just a thought that I had. But you were surprised by the flexibility results as well, that more people would value having time to work at home or flexible hours than would like paid leave. Now that may be because a lot of people have completed their family size. You had a lot of older workers in your sample, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it wasn't totally surprising just because the other work we've done on gender and work and parenting and work-life balance and all that, it has shown over and over again how much people value flexibility and understanding on the part of their coworkers and employers when they're going through even the day-to-day challenges or these bigger life experiences. So I think, and we heard in our focus groups, we heard people talking about the responsibility that they feel towards their coworkers and their employers, and the sense that they would like to feel that mutual sense of responsibility and caring and opportunity for flexibility on the part of their employers.
Yeah,
as well.
although it was interesting, there was quite a bit of concern about people abusing
Yeah,
leave
there
as well,
was.
right?
And the other thing I wanted to mention on that question about ranking different workplace arrangements and benefits. So if you look at the whole sample, we found that flexibility and paid leave were about on par. But when you look at people who have actually had one of these experiences in recent years, for them, paid leave topped flexibility.
Okay.
So for people who had been through that, they said that having that access to that benefit was extremely helpful for them, and they put flexibility a little bit lower. So it's important to keep that in mind too.
Juliana, on people's experience, and particularly the fear that you might lose your job if you took leave, or you might not advance as quickly, or you might be a burden on your fellow workers, that seemed to show up a lot. And another debate that we've been having in our group, and that I think will be a national debate as well, is some kind of job protection. Do you think that if job protection was part of the deal, that would help, or do you think people would still feel that, I can't afford to take this because it's going to look bad?
Well, I think for the people who said that they were concerned they might lose their job, that could certainly help. But across income groups and across different types of leave, what we saw was that the top reason that people either didn't take time off when they needed or wanted to, or took less time off, was due to financial concerns. And so even with job protection, there might still be a concern that if you're losing all or a part of your wages and your salary, that you might still not be able to take time off when you need to, or take less time off than you would have liked. And so, and for a lot of people, it was more than one thing. So, for that question, people could say yes to multiple things. And so, and many people did. And so it's not necessarily just one thing that keeps people from taking time off or from taking as much time off.
Yeah, another thing, by the way, that surprised me was the proportion of especially the lower income workers who went on welfare because of the financial burden of having a baby.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, too, that the question asked about public assistance, and so that could have meant a lot of different things. Like for some people, it could have meant going on unemployment, for example, and for some people, it might have meant food stamps, and so we didn't specify exactly what type of public assistance, but some sort of wage replacement that came from a government.
Another interesting thing, if I could just point
Sure.
out that in addition to concern over losing your job, we also had a question about impact of taking leave on one's career. And for most workers, they say that taking leave didn't have an impact one way or another, but women are more likely to say that it had a negative impact on their career than men are, I think about 2 times as likely. Yeah.
Do we have time for a couple questions from the audience? Who wants to get in here? Yes, back there, yep. Can't hear you. Think maybe the mic is not.
Zozaliak Michelle from the Center for Law and Social Policy. I actually had a question about the question that was asked where they said flexibility in working hours would benefit them more than paid leave, most of them. So if I read the phrasing on the question correctly, it said which of these would help you the most, not would or does. So-
It says
It
yeah.
said, would or has, I think.
Which one of the
Would or has. Okay, so
yeah, is or would be, because
Yeah,
some
is or
people
would be.
have it and some people don't have it, and
Right.
so
That was going to be my question, was whether they were picking among the things they didn't yet
Yeah.
have. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Vicki?
Where is there was someone over here, yeah.
Um,
There's a woman up front with a question.
Sorry,
too, as well.
I'm sorry I couldn't see you, so.
That's okay. Vicki Shabo from the National Partnership for Women and Families.
You're
and
right.
Thank you for this report. It's fantastic. Just one point to sort of piggyback on what Belle was saying about the small business piece, which is there's some new data from Small Business Majority that came out last week showing that 70% of small businesses support a national social insurance plan. Like the Family Act, which I think actually dovetails really nicely in some ways with the data here. So one interpretation of the data here is that people see this in a very individualistic framework because that's what they know. They're used to getting benefits from their employers. In the US context, we don't really have programs that provide for paid leave except for in a couple of states. And so when you ask people how it is that they want this provided, employers are sort of the most natural place for their mind to go. And then when you ask about policy solutions, if they're already thinking employers are where they're going to get this, then of course tax credits for employers make the most intuitive sense, rather than thinking about a government program. But what's interesting is that businesses, as Belle said, often don't want a mandate like this and would rather have a social insurance program. And part of what this Small Business Majority polling shows, it's consistent with some other small business research that's happened, is that small businesses really like the idea of a pooled system. So just to add to the mix of conversation, I don't know whether you all saw a difference in the focus groups between people who worked for smaller businesses or larger businesses, but I don't know if there's anything there to sort of tease out. So I guess I have a comment more than a question, but if you have any.
If I just piggyback quickly, I think it's a really important point, and it was interesting that people knew about whether they had health insurance and some other benefits. They didn't know, a lot of them, whether they had paid parental leave or not, as a specific carve out from everything else.
That's right, and I think with that in particular, and we did see that in the focus groups in terms of just the confusion about what people do and don't have, and often until you need something like paid family or medical leave, until you're going to have a baby or you're faced with some sort of medical emergency, you might not have had a reason to even know whether or not that's available to you, whereas vacation, health insurance, those types of things everybody taps into. But in terms of Vicki's comment, I mean, I do think that that's part of it. People are used to those types of benefits coming from employers. But also, like in other polling that we've done, and even some comparative polling across the world, that just in general, Americans tend to be more individualistic. And when we've asked about different benefits and whether it's been providing for people as they age and making sure that people's financial well-being is taken care of, that in particular when we compare Americans to Western Europeans, that Western Europeans tend to have more of a view that that the government should provide and more supportive of a social safety net than Americans in general. So not just in terms of benefits that employers provide, but just as just a more general value that Americans have.
Okay, well, I think we probably should move to the break and then to the second panel. But I want to thank both of you and all of Pew for this great report. I think it's going to be enormously useful. We will be putting out a report probably in our working group probably in June. And for those of you who are interested in this set of issues, we have a set of blog posts. They are on the AEI website. They should be on the Brookings website as well, but I think they're easier to find on AEI. And thank you all for being here, and we'll take a break. And then, 5 minutes, no more. Please come back. We're going to start on time. Thank you again to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, we're ready to begin round 2. So if you could all get a fresh cup of coffee and get seated.
When we think, I'm just going to kind of blow through my slides.
Yeah.
Did you want us to come up here or just
Yeah,
sit?
I think it'll be better because I think the slide thing doesn't work that well when you're sitting. Great, so let me introduce my panelists for this round. We will begin with Bridget Schulte. Bridget serves as the director of the Better Life Lab at the nonpartisan think tank New America, which seeks to elevate the conversation, explore transformative solutions, and highlight how work, life, gender equity, and social policy issues are key to excellence, productivity, and innovation, as well as a full, authentic, and meaningful life for everyone. She is also the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, which was named one of the notable books of the year by the Washington Post and NPR. So welcome, Bridget. Harry Holzer is the John Lafarge Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University and an Institute Fellow at the American Institute for Research in Washington, D.C. He is a former chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor and a former professor of economics at Michigan State University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Sabrina Schaefer is the executive director of the Independent Women's Forum. She has extensive experience in communications. She has conducted academic and applied research on persuasion, speech writing in the U.S. Senate, communications at a major nonprofit, public relations at a DC consulting firm, and media relations in a primary campaign. She is a regular on Forbes on Fox and Fox Businesses After the Bell. Richard Reeves is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where he is also policy director of the Center on Children and Families and editor-in-chief of the Social Mobility Memos blog. His research focuses on social mobility, inequality, and family change. Before joining Brookings, he was director of strategy to the United Kingdom's deputy prime minister. So welcome to all of you, and we'll begin with Bridget.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sort of like Dancing with the Stars. I wonder if I'm going to turn round and round or something. Well, thank you so much, Aparna, for that great introduction. And let's see. Go like this?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to I'm going to touch on some high points. First of all, I just want to say, like as everyone else had, the Pew report is just amazing. One of the things that I'm really going to focus on, I'm a writer and a journalist, so I'm out talking to a lot of people and companies, and so I'm hearing a lot of stories, and what I hear is a lot of confusion out there. People really don't know what they have, they don't know who's paying what, and so I'm going to outline some of that today. I think there's a real opportunity that the report highlights for really bringing facts and education and real understanding, because it really isn't there. So let's start with, and I'm focusing on the parental leave part of this, but again, it is through having leave throughout the life course that we're talking about. We're not robots. People do get sick. People do have caregiving needs. And the workforce, as you know, has changed, and we don't have the American wife at home anymore taking care of all those caregiving responsibilities. So how are we going to update our cultures and our structures? So I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to begin with. And the first thing is, when the child is born, this is the most active time for the brain development. There's like 1,000 new neural connections that are made every second in the first 3 years of life. This is a critical time for laying the foundation for all future learning, for all language development. I think it's really important to note that the achievement gap that we talk a lot about, that really is so important when we think about social mobility and opportunity in this country. More than half of that achievement gap is already present the very first day of kindergarten. So think about that. When we talk about early education, we really do mean starting at birth. And a lot of countries look at paid family leave as really the beginning of early education and childcare. So this is a really critical time. One of the most important ways that infants learn is being really attuned to another person, having what they call serve and return communication, where there's a real kind of not only a proffer, but also waiting for a response. And that takes time, and it takes real skill. So So that's really critical. You know, there has been some really interesting research, some of it here in the United States, in some of the few states that do have paid family leave systems like California, but most of this research has been done in Europe, looking at the duration of leave and different sort of health and wellness outcomes. And I do think it's important to note that paid family leave, particularly maternity leave, has been associated with reduced infant mortality. It's been associated with reduced maternal depression, and one study found that held true for 30 years. 30 years later, there were lower rates of maternal depression. EY has just come out with a really interesting study, and the Boston Consulting Group and others have also talked about economic benefits, and I think that Pew Research found that, talked a little bit about that as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the gender equality benefits, but there are clear and substantive health, wellness, and development benefits. I know we're going to be talking about costs to companies, but we also have to think of larger societal costs as well in terms of continuing with the status quo, which isn't really working very well, or not doing anything. Because the status quo right now, I think you've heard all of this, the United States is the only advanced economy that does not have any kind of paid family leave scheme. I think one of the recent reports from the World Bank said it was the United States, Tonga, and Suriname, so maybe Papua New Guinea's still in there. So we're not in really great company. And then getting back to this question of confusion, a lot of people, when I've reported, it's astounding to me. I'll still get calls from people who are 7 months pregnant and then in tears and will say, I didn't know we didn't have paid family leave in this country. I'm about to go out on leave and I'm going to get, maybe just a few weeks, or I haven't even saved up my vacation. So there's a lot of, I don't want to call it ignorance, but we just haven't had large national discussions until very recently. I think most of the media coverage, just from, if you just think about, in the last couple of years, there hasn't been a lot. And then in recent years, it's sort of been a big flash when, say, Amazon or Netflix or Vodafone or somebody, usually in the high-tech or financial services companies, do something amazing, and then they make everybody else feel really jealous. But I can tell you from a kind of a media standpoint, there is this feeling of movement. Well, we're solving it, right? And I think it's really important that the Pew Research and others show that it's really not being solved. The Families and Work Institute, they just came out with their most recent national study, The Employer. And they found really virtually no change in who offers paid family leave really over the since about 2008. Things have actually started going down from a high point in 2005. I also think what's really important is, when we talk about maternity leave, a lot of people think, well, I get paid maternity leave. About half of workers report that for women. But more than 2/3 of that funding actually comes from temporary disability insurance, and people don't really understand that. That's one of the reasons why maternity leaves tend to be 6 weeks, because you get a 6 weeks disability payment if you have a vaginal birth, and an 8-week disability payment if you have a cesarean section, which, yes, that is what I got. So what's offered men is even less. They 15%, which has stayed pretty steady since 2005. Only 6% of all maternity leaves are fully paid in the United States, according to the Families and Work Institute. So again, people don't really know what's out there. Even when I was doing some reporting and talking to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's where the 14% figure comes from, that the civilian workforce has access to paid family leave. And they say they don't even know if that's really paid family leave or some kind of cobbling together of vacation, temporary disability. So even in our statistical reporting, we don't have a lot of clarity on what's out there and what's offered and what's working. One of the things that we've done at New America, we did a large study trying to map out the infrastructure of childcare in the United States and rated every state on cost, quality, and availability. And I will tell you again, most other advanced economies treat paid family leave as infant care, because infant care is wildly expensive. We found the average cost, about $10,000 a year, was greater than the average cost of in-state tuition in more than 33 states. Others have made similar findings like that. So families are incredibly strapped. We found that the average cost of nanny care is like $28,000 a year. which is 3 times the average cost of in-state tuition and more than half of the median household income. So again, not many people have nannies, but child care expensive, in particular infant care is really expensive. And again, going back to that point of confusion, when we're talking about the Pew finding, which I thought was so interesting, that people felt that employers should pay for it. That's really not the case in most other countries when you look around the world, in countries that do have these kinds of paid family leave schemes. If you see like the OECD and high-income countries, most of them are employer and government or government-only paid. Very few have, I think, South Africa is more of an employer mandate. So again, not a lot of understanding about how these systems work, who pays, and how they function internationally. And I think here it's probably worth mentioning that there's a lot of variety, not to make people cry, but in the EU, the average maternity leave is 23 weeks. In the OECD countries, there's a lot of variation. I think in Bulgaria, you can have a maternity leave over a year. Now there are, there is sort of a sweet spot, if you will, in terms of duration of leave, not enough, and then you don't have the health and wellness and development benefits for kids or families, but too long, and then you tend to disadvantage women. They either don't go back to the workforce, they don't go back to the level of where they were, or there's a disincentive to hire and promote them. And I know that other speakers are going to speak about this, but Juliana mentioned people still tend to think that mothers are better at this and that mothers should take longer leave, and a lot of that is because we still have very powerful cultural norms. And I just wanted to briefly mention, we still have the ideal worker norm. I don't know if you remember this Cadillac commercial where the guy's like, why do we work all the time? We get a lot of stuff. That's the great thing about only getting 2 weeks off. And I think the important thing to note about that is only like 1 in 4 US workers do not have access to paid vacation time, and they tend to be low-wage workers. So there's real difference in terms of where you stand on the socioeconomic scale and what you're able to avail yourself of. So we have these ideal worker standard, kind of ideal, which is WFD Consulting did a poll where they asked managers and CEOs around the world, who is the ideal worker? And more than 3/4 of them said someone with no caregiving responsibilities. So we still have very powerful kind of breadwinner, male, ideal worker notions. And at the same time, we still have very powerful ideal mother notions, that the ideal mother is always available to her children. The ideal mother obviously does not have a job. Excuse me. And those are very powerful, and you see that in unconscious bias. And it also shows up in the way we work. So women are still doing about twice the housework and childcare in many countries, in the United States in particular. And in the United States, where we do tend to value overwork and reward, particularly for knowledge workers, long hours, you can see that there's a real overworked gender gap, that women are simply not able to put in those kinds of hours. And that is in part what contributes to the pay gap, and also to sort of women being stuck in the marzipan sticky middle layer and not really rising in positions of leadership in virtually any field or industry. So one last thing I'm going to leave you with in some of the reporting that I've done. What's really interesting is when you look at what other countries have done, and the Scandinavian countries initially really advantaged women and gave them very long maternity leaves, only to find that was really disadvantaging them, and their mission for what they espouse as gender equality. Many of these countries have ministers of gender equality, and they were seeing that was actually really freezing men and women in those breadwinner and caregiver roles. Even though women were working, they tended to work part-time. There was a lot of occupational segregation. Women were not working in the private sector, but in the public sector. So they began a propaganda campaign in Sweden. It was called Project Dad. And they wanted to try to create this norm, sort of socially engineer, if you will, try to create this norm that men are caregivers. So that's apparently some famous Swedish wrestler. And you would see these on buses and in clinics, sort of trying to create the cultural norm that men are and can be really great caregivers. And so one of the things that countries like Iceland did, they were very late to the game of paid family leave, not until 2000. And so then they were looking around at sort of the mistakes other countries had made and wanted to figure out, could they engineer a paid family leave 2.0 system? And so they created one of the very first, what they call use it or lose it, kind of a nudge. You know, if you want to use a behavioral science term, how could you kind of nudge men to take more leave? Because if you get more men taking leave early on, the thought was, could that create more gender equality at work and at home later on? And so they had a sort of a natural experiment where they looked at the trajectory of looking at time diaries and other data before that use it or lose it Daddy Day quota started. And you can see here, before the Daddy Day quota, the red line, that's mother-only care. And at birth, women are doing the majority of the care. And 3 years later, they are also doing the majority of the care. That's certainly the case here in the United States as well. And after that Daddy Day quota, this is what I find so interesting, is it initially, again, it makes a lot of sense right after birth. Mothers are doing the majority of the care, you're bonding, you're breastfeeding. But 3 years later, when the child now is a toddler, you look at the yellow line, those are couples who are either married or cohabiting, and you see that 70% of them are equally sharing child care, which then they found has also equalized the time that they spend at work, so they don't have that same differential. And that actually is creating the kinds of change that they initially were hoping for, which is promoting more gender equality at work and at home. So, and then the last thing I'll leave you with, because this always so strikes me, you know, the Labor Department that found that 1 in 4 women return to work within 2 weeks. Well, in 25 states, it's illegal to separate a puppy from its mother before 7 weeks. So just thought I would throw that out there.
Well, thank you. I want to talk about, can we get my slides on the,
I think if you click,
just click
yeah, it should come.
there. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of how do we balance the benefits and costs. And this will very much be how do economists tend to think about this issue. And both Bell and Bridget have already made references to some of these costs. And I'll be repeating at least some of the things Bell put on the table, but just wrestling with this a little more. According to the Pew report, workers do perceive the benefits of paid family leave very accurately. And the research evidence bears out every one of these perceptions. It's good for women who are in the labor force. That enables them to remain attached to employers when they have kids, which they otherwise wouldn't have. It's good, definitely good for the newborn children, the babies, the brain development that Bridget talked about. It's good for other family members when it's paid family leave. And in many ways, it's good for the economy, again, because it keeps these women in the labor force, and we need more people attached to the workplace. And it even provides some benefits for employers. Again, those employers who are trying to improve their reputation, because that means they find it easier to recruit and retain high-quality workers. That's why a lot of employers on their own choose to provide it, and Walmart apparently is the latest employer. Walmart historically had a very bad reputation as an employer. They're making a very conscious effort to upgrade that reputation because they think it will be in their interest, both nationally but in terms of its workforce. So there's all these benefits, all that's correct, and yet I think, and many people do, that too few workers have it, because when you look at less educated employees, or when you look at those in small and medium-sized firms, you see it much less rarely provided, despite all these benefits. So my punchline, I do believe that women should have universal access to paid leave in an affordable manner, and I think it's in the public interest. The public sector should encourage it, because in many ways it is a public good. When you have a public good that private workers and firms aren't paying for, it makes sense for the government, I think, to subsidize it. But then, of course, we do get to the costs as well as the benefits. And I think the costs are substantial. And very interesting, in the Pew report, you saw that people have much more disagreement about who ought to pay the costs. And of course, the majority of workers just make employers do it, as if that has no consequences for the workers whom they hire. And by the way, to me, this is a typical American thing. Americans love their public benefits, don't want to pay the costs of it through taxes or through anything else. And here's one more example of that. And economists think about this very differently. My friends in the advocate community, and some of them, of course, are here today, I think don't spend enough time worrying about the costs, right? So more is better. If the research shows that this amount is good, then this amount must be great. And that's one way to think about it. But economists think about that very differently. And when you have to think about the costs as well as the benefits, you're looking for some optimum where that kind of social and private good gets balanced against the costs. And the costs aren't too high because the costs, one way or the other, always do create unanticipated consequences that end up hurting workers in other ways. And again, so we're trying to find that sweet spot of that optimum. And so you can see that's my view. And so how do we get that balance right? And by the way, there's no clear answer. There's no objective statement that can say this is exactly the point at which we get that optimum, and different people have different points of view. But I want all of us to take the costs seriously and to wrestle with them. So what, in fact, are those costs? Well, the first cost is simply financially who pays for it. As Bell said this morning, most economists think it's a bad idea just to impose this mandate on employers. You pay for it, because it will make that labor much more expensive in the eyes of the employer, and they will hire fewer people if you do that. So for us, for economists, doing this through a payroll tax, through a broader social insurance rate makes a lot more sense. Spreads the costs among everybody. And in fact, the states that have chosen to do this, every state that has chosen to do this is choosing the payroll tax, not this mandate on employers. The 3 states out of the box early, California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, do this. New York has voted to do this. They're going to start in 2018. The DC City Council has voted to do this. I know they're still wrestling with some of the details on that, but that will likely happen. So everyone who's doing this is going in that direction. How large is that tax? It's in the ballpark of 1% of payroll. In some states less, in some states closer. And I view an extra 1%. If you take an extra 1% out of workers' paychecks, it's not huge. It's not a huge cost to them. It's not trivial either, to make workers, and especially those who are already stretched, take one more percentage point out of their pay for this one thing. Now, of course, economists also point out, who's really paying, right? So if you say, well, we're just going to impose the payroll tax on employers, it doesn't mean employers are really paying for it, because employers can shift the cost to their workers by taking it out of their paychecks. And the evidence suggests that's mostly what they do when you make employers pay for it, but not all of it. And especially if you're talking about really low-wage workers close to the minimum wage, they can't take it all out of their paycheck, right? Because they're already brushing up against the bottom. So employers will pay for it. I think employers perceive that they bear the whole burden, even if they can successfully shift it onto workers. But that's sort of, the financial cost is only, I think, one piece of it. There are other costs, and those other costs, I think, have unanticipated consequences. This is disruptive to employers, especially if you make them hold the job for the worker going away. And I think it makes sense in most cases to have the employers hold the job. But that does make it disruptive to employers, and especially in small firms. Again, as Bell pointed out, if you're a large company, it's not that expensive to hire a temp or to spread the work among other employees for that 3-month period, let's say. It's much harder if you're a small employer. You have 8, 10, 15 employees. They don't have that flexibility to just shift the work onto other folks. It may be costlier for them to bring a temp in. So it is costly to small firms for us to do that. But then the costs also depend a lot on the parameters. We haven't talked at all about what the parameters of this should be. The duration. In other words, how long should the duration be? Should it be 4 to 6 weeks, which the first 3 states made it? Of course, as some of the previous speakers said, the 4 to 6 weeks is misleading, because a lot of the workers also take temporary disability, which many other states don't have. New York starts with 8, they're going up to 12. DC has said 8. I think the 8 to 12 range myself is reasonable, but then the replacement rate on wages becomes really important. Just as a comparison, the unemployment insurance system mostly gives you a 50%. In other words, what fraction of your lost wages and salaries are replaced? Unemployment insurance is mostly 50% up to a cap. The states that have done this so far are talking about 50 to 70%. DC is talking about 90%. It's a very high replacement rate, up to a fairly high cap. And the replacement rates and the durations affect the take-up, right? When you have really, really, really high replacement rates, workers will not have any incentive to try to limit how much of this they do. So the take-up rates will be much higher. And in fact, we don't have research on what's the impact on employers and on take-up when you have 90% replacement rates. Now, again, there's a trade-off. If our main goal is to make low-wage workers, low-income workers comfortable with this, they can't afford a 50% replacement rate. They may not be able to afford a 70% replacement rate. So I understand from the low-wage worker point of view why the high replacement rate might be important, but again, the cost. Think of how the costs, both the fiscal cost and the cost to employers. And finally, I want to talk about this unanticipated effect, this issue of discrimination against women, which Bell mentioned. I think that's real. This is not something economists have cooked up. There have been, and just as one example, there's research on the Americans with Disability Act, which we imposed on employers in the 1990s. Some very good research has shown that it did reduce the hiring of folks with disabilities by about 10%, which is really a pretty big cut because it made it much more costly for employers to bring them on board. And I fear that a similar thing would happen. Now, some people say, well, that's crazy. Look, a lot of these employers are providing it anyway. Employers perceiving it as a benefit is very different than imposing it on them. And I think employers are much more likely to see it. I think employers see their professional employees very differently. They view them as long-term assets to the company. They view them as sticking around 5, 10, 15 years. They're willing to invest 3 months off here, 3 months off there, not a big deal because this is a valued employee. I don't think they think the same way about their less educated employees, whom they view as being much more high turnover, less likely to stay around. And frankly, I think people have stereotypes about who has babies and who doesn't. And I think they're going to view, there's actually some statistical evidence in favor of those stereotypes, but they're going to view less educated and especially minority women as much more likely to have these babies, much more likely to take these leaves and to be in and out. And I believe it will cause them to hire fewer of them. And I fear that as a big unanticipated consequence. Again, we don't have direct evidence on that. It's just something to keep in mind when we do this. Then, the other problem, absent a sensible federal policy, and I think we should have a sensible federal policy, the states and cities are going to go ahead and do it on their own. And you see this now. But you see very, very big differences between the blue states and the big blue cities are doing this. The red states pretty much are not. So you're starting to create huge variation across the country in these labor costs. What I see in the blue areas, and you can make the case that if it was only paid leave and no other issues to worry about, that we ought to be fairly generous and the benefits are high and we should be able to bear the cost. The problem is, think about DC. DC City Council has imposed a $15 minimum wage, banned the box, it mandated number of sick days. There's a lot of other costs on employers, and now this very generous paid leave policy. And my concern is the cumulative effect of all of these things together that are being imposed in many blue states and cities on employers. I do believe, economists call it a nonlinear effect. I believe there are tipping points that employers can live with a little bit of this cost and a little bit of this cost. But at some point, and I'm hearing this from DC employers a lot, that they feel burned by how many costs are being imposed by them in the city council. And by the way, across in Arlington, Virginia, none of that exists. 7.25 minimum wage, no paid leave. And I know, I'm hearing from that location is looking better and better to them all the time. So what they can change their locations. It's not that easy. And by the way, they don't even have to shut down the establishment and move it. They can just very gradually shift, open new establishments across the river, shift their greater hiring across the river. And I think you're going to see more of that. And frankly, we are in a world where robotics are going to do a lot more of the work. And I'm not one of these Luddites that fear the robots are going to take everything over. That's not how labor markets work. But I do perceive in fast food establishments and other places, I have the sense that robots will be much more available 10 years from now. And that if we make it so costly to hire low-wage workers, the shift in that direction, I think, will be more rapid and more dramatic. At least that's a possibility. And again, I don't have direct evidence on most of this, but all economic reasoning tells me that's true. So to conclude, you may have forgotten this. I support universal paid family leave. And not just for the poor. I think this is a benefit that we ought to get to everybody. But we really need to wrestle. And again, I don't know what the right answer is. We need to wrestle with the costs as well as the benefits. We need to wrestle with, if you impose these costs on employers, what are they going to turn around and do to their workers? We need to wrestle this when we think about replacement rates, durations, and try to come up with some sensible balance of those factors. Thank you.
thought that Harry just gave my remarks. I may not end in the same way, but again, thank you to Aparna and to AEI for having me. Like Kim, I also started my career here, just in a different building, so it's always nice to be back. I think I have too many gadgets up here. All right. And also, I should say that I come at this issue, I should move this along, huh? As a working mom, I have 3 young children. I really love being a mother too. I mean, if you told me that my husband was going to be the primary caregiver when I had those babies, I would be like, you're out of your mind. I'm going to spend every minute that I can, and I'm constantly telling my husband that I aspire to be that ideal mom who is like the cookies when my kids get home. Probably more like for like a week, and then it would get old. But I also have a father with Alzheimer's who lives on the West Coast, so I realize that this is not an issue that just affects sort of happy times. It's also that need to take care of aging parents and other people in our lives. And I'm also the head of a women's organization. So we have currently 2 people out on maternity leave, 1 person out for a medical emergency, and so I'm very familiar as sort of the head of an organization what this means in terms of trying to balance work productivity with caring for people who I think of as family, because we're a small staff of 14. But I do think that if we let the data guide us, and this has been a tremendous amount of data here right in front of us, we will come up with sensible policy solutions, Harry mentioned, that will be good for workers, for employees, for businesses, and also, I think, to Bridget's point, for our culture, because it's not just about dollars and cents. This is about what kind of society we want to live in. And I think in our new worlds of sort of changing gender roles, we have to realize that this is no longer just a women's issue. As we sort of stretch our budgets and more households are dependent on 2-earner incomes, this becomes more important. We are, as Bridget noted, there isn't someone necessarily automatically at home. So when someone gets sick, it is a stress in a way that it may not have been in previous generations. And so that means that we do have a new challenge. But I think that before we sort of move to the policy piece, we do have to ask ourselves just how large the problem is. I realize, yes, that the American workplace is terribly behind, that we are up there with, I think what Saudi Arabia has sort of a national paid leave system that we don't have. But there are real drawbacks. We've already heard a little bit about how when women return in some of our European counterparts, they're working part-time, they're working at lower levels. And so I think it's important to keep this in mind, that these are not sort of apples to apple comparisons. And just because Washington doesn't mandate that all businesses provide that, or that we don't have a federal policy, it doesn't mean that companies are failing to provide this. The reality, I think, is fairly encouraging. If you look, I know the statistics, everybody's got a different one, a different number. Even in some of our own publications, I've noticed we're using different numbers, so it's hard to find, to pinpoint the exact numbers, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that 75% of full-time workers have access to paid sick leave. 74% have access to paid personal leave. And 88% have access to unpaid family leave. So I think what we're really talking about is low-income workers, as Kim and Juliana pointed out. And I think we want to be careful, as Harry pointed out, that we don't create more barriers to entry, because those are the people who are going to be impacted the most. But before we launch into sort of the deeper discussion of the best policy solutions to tackle this issue per se, I think it's important to take note that women, and I'd sort of go out on a limb here and say that men as well, are not all the same, right? We don't all have equal professional goals, needs, challenges. The decisions I made when I was 22 about the workplace are different from what I'll make today at 39, and certainly they'll probably be different than what I would make 10 years from now. And so I think we want to make sure that the workplace remains this dynamic environment that allows people to make different choices as their needs and their wants and preferences change over time. And I feel like very often, and I thought this was really an interesting point with Pew, that lawmakers will come to us and say, we have this massive problem, with this problem of paid leave. But the reality is, when you ask people, they don't quite see it as that dramatic. They do see the economy as hugely problematic, and I think for a lot of people, the economy is a catch-all phrase for my personal situation, my personal finances, my personal work situation. So it may be higher than the very bottom of the list, but I don't think it's necessarily quite the crisis stage that we often hear it talked about. So in order not to put the cart in front of the horse, IWF did some research last year to talk about, what do women want in the workplace? Before we assume that all they care about is paid leave, let's sort of take a step back. And hopefully this research was intended to inform our discussions on paid leave and on child care. And personally, just from a sort of more conservative perspective, I was kind of wondering, have Republicans and conservatives really been quite this asleep at the wheel? Are they that tone deaf? It's possible. Or is there sort of more to the story? And so we conducted a conjoint analysis, which in effect was just a way of creating forced choices for people. But we looked at a number of different workplace attributes, from workplace flexibility to healthcare packages, employee tenure, bonus structure, vacation leave, things of this nature. And it allowed us to create this constrained choice between job packages, ultimately giving us sort of causal evidence of what job attributes really matter to people, and by how much, right? So it turns out that a lot of the biggest findings, and I'll just flip through these really quickly, you don't have to take note, but in brief, mothers value time off more than non-mothers, sort of to be expected. Non-mothers seem to care about everything but workplace flexibility options and paid sick and vacation leave. So I think that tells us something, in effect, that mothers are flexibility maximizers while non-mothers are earnings maximizers, which I think is what we would sort of encourage people, right? When I first got out of school, I should have been more of an earnings maximizer. I didn't even negotiate my salary, but that's another conversation. But we should be talking about how do you maximize those earnings, and maybe you want to negotiate something with your employer when you don't really need a whole lot of time off. We found that progressive women, interestingly enough, value their annual salary and family medical leave above all else. Conservative women, self-identified in each of these cases, value the character of the company. What Rich Karlgaard at Forbes, he refers to this as the soft features of a company. Things like employee tenure. I think it's a cue to people if it's a good work environment, something like employee tenure. But of course, everybody likes getting more benefits, more wages, so it's easy to talk about universal paid leave, for instance, because who is against the idea of a mom taking some time off or caring for an aging parent? And that's why I think Pew just found that 82% of Americans say that mothers should have access to maternity leave. And I think that that's a good thing. We want to be moving in that direction as a culture and as an environment. I want to feel not resentful towards the women in my office who just had babies, but excited for them and say, hey, sure, we brought in a temp and we'll shift work around because we're excited for you because you're part of this family and we've invested in you and we think you're going to come back and continue working for us, and we hope that you will. So I think, though, as Isabel mentioned, and as I think was clear from the Pew research, people, and as Harry certainly pointed out, people are, I think, intuitively aware that there are trade-offs and that there are costs associated with these benefits, right? They don't just come out of thin air as much as we would like them to. And when we talk about government paying for them, we're talking about taxpayers. The government doesn't have any money of its own. we give it to them. So I think that people, when they begin to hear other arguments about how some of these policies might affect them, are open to a more substantive conversation. And I think that's important. So at IWF, we've spent a lot of time talking about what an alternative policy might look like that will not burden employers, but that will maximize the choices for employees. And so in our report that we produced last year, Working for Women, which sort of deals with a suite of workplace policies that we hear a lot about, we propose a twofold policy solution, which would include, one, creating savings for leave time through personal care accounts, which would be a tax-preferred account, and provide tax credits for truly small businesses who can offer paid leave. And as we've heard, obviously a lot of businesses would love to be able to offer the kind of robust benefits that their larger counterparts can. And so being able to assist them is something that is not necessarily a downside. For a lot of businesses would say, great, I would love to keep those employees. I simply can't afford to offer what Google can down the street. I don't know if Google's a good example, actually. Or are they? Okay. So the tech industry is not always so great. So I think something to keep in mind is that we already encourage people to save pre-tax dollars for things like health savings accounts, flexible spending accounts, education savings accounts. Obviously, you can't save for everything. I would rather we just had, simplified tax system and we can just save, but that's probably not happening anytime in the near future. So at this point, I think it would still be better to give people that option to save. And we recommend up to 12 weeks of pay, or capping it at $5,000, so that people would have that money. It would be transportable. If you leave your job, you would still own those resources. And I think nonprofits, and we've seen this in the education sector, could be established. A lot of corporations would love to do this as part of their social responsibility portfolio to help low-income workers. Because once again, those are really the people who are falling through the cracks. So we saw people making over $75,000 are usually in a white-collar profession where they are offered leave. It may not be ideal, it may not be perfect, but they have access in a way that low-income workers simply do not. And of course, we propose coupling this with a tax credit for truly small businesses. We don't want it to be something that, Walmart's able to say, great, I've got this new tax credit, and it's just used to put the local hardware store out of business. We want this to truly be a way to assist those smaller businesses who would like to contribute. So that takes us to the question of whether or not the public is open to this idea. And I feel very enthusiastic that they are, actually. I think, as Bridget mentioned, and I'm probably equally at fault, there's a lot of confusion over this issue. What kind of access to paid leave? Who pays for the paid leave? When do you use the paid leave? Is this a women's issue, a man's issue, everybody issue? And so I think when people get a little bit more information, they realize that there are trade-offs, there are costs to the sort of top-down approach, and that they are wildly actually supportive of something that gives them more support. We did find that we conducted a randomized controlled trial last year. This is when the Healthy Family Act was being discussed. Similar to Pew, our control group was wildly supportive of this without any other information. About 60% of women in the control group supported it, only about 16% opposed it. It's a huge margin of support. But when they heard about how there may be an economic downside, how this may threaten their position in the workplace, that support dropped precipitously. And I think that that's important, because we can't just talk about this as if it's all rosy and that there's nothing downside. And so frequently I feel like, as sort of the free marketer, I'm kind of like throwing the wet blanket on things, but I think we have to. And then when people sort of have that information, they can be more informed, and we can have a more honest discussion. And while it was very easy to persuade conservative women of this, and they start out very supportive of sort of a top-down plan too, so for the progressives in the room, you should be encouraged. You can get conservatives, but I can get liberals. The progressive women also were mostly concerned, and I think this is really interesting, they were mostly concerned that this would have a downside on the working poor, that this would hurt the very people it's intended to help. And I thought that's very encouraging. When you talk about this in a sort of an emotional, personal way, about how this will hurt your chances in the workplace, we changed the margin of support into a margin of opposition by a sizable amount. So I will just wrap up by saying that in all areas of our lives right now, we allow and encourage customization. I can order my groceries today to be delivered this afternoon exactly the way I want them. I can get an affordable box of clothing sort of designed for me, delivered to my doorstep tomorrow. My kids don't even know what commercials are, right? We customize our television preferences. So I think that it's sort of strange to think that there's anything in the workplace that we would want to standardize, right? Why should I assume that what I want or need is going to be the same as anyone else in this room? It may be at some point, but we want to open the marketplace up, the workplace up, for that kind of customization that has benefited us in so many other areas. And I think if we do that, we'll move towards a policy that is sustainable, that is affordable, and that is appealing to the largest number of people. So, thank you.
I should be quick.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so I've just been told that I've got minus 3 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
So I should be very quick. I can't do it quite that quickly. This is my exhortation, but we don't need it. There's been lots of discussion of men and of fathers today, so we haven't forgotten Dad, which is great. So that means I can be very quick. I'll make two opening comments. The first is just a general point, which is the acknowledgement we can't have gender equality in the labour market unless we have gender equality in the distribution of unpaid work. It's just mathematically impossible. And so let's at least be honest about that. My experience of this is conservatives tend to be honest about that. They tend to say, well, of course women earn less and don't go as far. They're doing more of the childcare. That's at least internally consistent. Progressives very often fall into the trap of saying, well, we'd like women to still do more of the childcare and raise the kids, but we also want absolute gender equality at work. And it seems to me that at least the conservatives are being honest about that argument. And so the conclusion that I draw from that is, if we're serious about gender equality in the paid side of work, we have to be equally serious about gender equality in the unpaid side of work too. The second framing point I just want to make is because of my background in the UK, I was part of the government in the UK that transferred us from a maternity leave-based policy to a shared parental leave policy. So the coalition government in which I worked inherited a situation where we had 12 months of maternity leave, 12 months. 6 paid, 6 weeks. Anyway, the details don't matter. And we've replaced that now with effectively 12 months that's shared between parents. They both have to have work, we both have work requirements. There's some complexity there, but we've basically taken the chunk of time and said, why don't you figure out between yourselves how you want to use that time? So I was part of that process. I've basically stolen everyone else's slides. So this is one from Pew, thanks to Kim and Juliana, and generally to Pew for the work that they do. I just think that's quite a remarkable finding. So I wanted to put it there again, because it's, aside from breastfeeding, who does a better job of caring for a new baby? Now, admittedly, there aren't very many who say that dad is best at it, but still, to have that kind of number who are saying equally, and in fact, among the under 50s, it's more than half saying that they're equally good at it, and they're the ones who, from a parenting point of view, should probably care about the most. So I just think that is, of course, there's some social desirability bias in there, but that is nonetheless a striking finding. Another finding I just wanted to pull out, which I haven't stolen this slide, but it's on page 49 of the report. It's also striking that most people don't think that when you have a young child in the house, both working full-time is the optimum. And that's true among younger workers as well. It's only 1 in 4 who say the ideal is let's both work full-time. But then when you dig into that and say, okay, so for those who don't think you should both be working full-time, that it should either be 1 at home or 1 part-time, what should the gender of the one who's working part-time or at home being? And the answer is we don't care. And the more educated the respondent, the less likely they are to say that they care. So it doesn't matter. So I think that's quite an interesting blend of what you might call a quotes conservative view, which is it's good if someone's around to help raise young kids, ideally one of their parents, and an egalitarian view, which is, but we shouldn't presume that that should be exclusively of one gender. So just wanted to draw attention to that finding too, because I think it's important. Now, I think someone just said we all have our own numbers. These are numbers from the American Family Survey that Carlin Bowman, Brad Wilcox, and I advise. And there's 2 things to say here. One is that when you ask, in this survey, they had much longer periods of leave than the Pew survey finds, 2 or 3 times as long in terms of what people said that their paid leave should be. But it's one of those things where you dig into it, and I don't know the answer yet, but I'm pretty sure these are means, whereas the median is the number presented in the Pew report. And if you dig into their numbers, you'll find that 41% of the Pew respondents said 12 weeks or more for mothers. So the median is going to give you a pretty different answer to the mean. That's not to say one is right or wrong, by the way. I'm just saying that when you're presenting this kinds of data, you can get quite different answers, because that 41% is probably going to pull up the mean quite a bit. But the reason I originally was going to put it up was that the BYU researchers who conducted this did something quite interesting, which is that they switched, for half the respondents, they asked about fathers and paternity leave first, then about maternity leave. And those are the results you can see on the right. It's when you ask about paternity leave before maternity leave, and the other, it's the other way around. And although the effects aren't absolutely dramatic, if you look at it, you can see that the gap reduces very significantly, right? The overall levels don't really change. So I just present that as tentative evidence that even in the way, the order in which you ask questions in a survey can disrupt the way people think about this, and it can disrupt them away from the traditional social norm. So if you ask about how much time should mums get off, and then, oh, how much time should dads get off, you get a different answer to if you ask how much time should dads get off, then how much time should mums get off. So it's a nerdy kind of survey point, but it might speak to a kind of deeper truth about the importance of social norms. Most of the other stuff I can go through pretty quickly because it's been covered. How much leave do men get in America? None, by comparison to all these other countries at a federal level anyway. This is OECD data, which is again showing paternity leave. And the reason I'm going to put this up is because it shows you on the left how long, this is just for fathers, how long a leave you can get, and on the right, what's the replacement rate. Typically, the shorter the leave, and I've cut this off, so that's why the US is on there. The short leave might even be at 100%. This is the UK in the old days. So if it's only like 1 or 2 weeks, it's quite generous. But then as the leave gets longer, then the replacement rate's going to go down. But look at Japan. Japan has arguably the most generous paternity or father-based leave policy in the world. It's very, very long, and it's very generously replacement rate. And how many Japanese men take it? Answer, almost none. Last time I looked at it, it was about 2%, 3% of Japanese men will actually kind of take it. All right? And so I just want to say that we can't assume policy will change culture, which is why these norms points and culture points are hugely important. That's despite adverts like this. This is not a government one. This is Nivea, Japan in the 2000s in an attempt to kind of shift some of the social norms about whether or not it's a good idea for Japanese men to take time off to look after their kids. And it didn't seem to have much effect, whereas the one that Bridget put up before, and I'm shocked she didn't know who it was. It's Hoa Dahlgren, the Swedish wrestler. Apparently.
I'll make a note of that.
Yeah. And in Sweden, we have seen a real shift in norms. Someone asked me if I knew what barnledig means. I don't know if there are any Swedish speakers here. I can only... Sorry? Daddy on leave. Daddy on child. Thank you so much. I assumed it was, can I hide in your hair? I think Bridget mentioned the Quebec shift. There's a whole series of policy experiments that have just basically provided use it or lose it policies for fathers. And there's a very good study by Anna Patnaik of the Quebec shift towards a more generous policy, and it also had 5 weeks that were basically only available to fathers. And the paper really does a very good job because she can compare it to the other provinces that didn't introduce it and a before and after. And sometimes when you're doing this kind of work, you're really squeezing the data to get a finding. You're really trying to do a difference in difference and see if you can find it, where is it, and you're really having to sort of squirrel away to try and find it. Well, she doesn't need to do that. This is the before and after with the provinces that didn't have the policy change along the bottom and Quebec before and after. And this is participation rate in leave of the men. So she probably didn't need to actually do all that incredibly sophisticated statistical work. She did kind of find this because it's pretty obvious. At least there, in that cultural context, if you get offered men leave that was otherwise not going to be available to the couple, the men took it. And she finds, similarly to the work that Bridget cited, that there's this shift in kind of gender relations thereafter. And so you can change it. Having said that, it seems to me that really our goal should be to try and move towards giving more choice and flexibility to parents and allowing them to decide for themselves. I am torn on this issue, and I was torn on it in government. But for those of us who have criticized maternity-based policies that essentially reinforce this idea that this is just for women and a form of social engineering, we should be very careful not to just replace it with our own form of social engineering, which is, okay, let's just make some of this available to men. Tempting though that is, for those of us who want to shift social norms quickly, I think it is a more intellectually respectable position to try and find a situation in which you just give families as much choice as possible about how they will divide the labor between themselves, and trust that over time the social norms will evolve in the right way. So my conclusion is simply this, that attitudes have shifted. We should aim for equality in leave policy, give as much choice and flexibility as possible, and that culture and social norms matter a lot. And I'm also on Twitter, and I've got a newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your comments, and we have some time for questions. I'm just going to open it up. I think, as Belle mentioned, one of the things that I found confusing in the Pew report was this overwhelming support for employers need to be doing something on paid leave. Like, this is not a government issue. This is something that employers need to handle. And at the same time, let's not do it through a mandate. Let's do it through voluntary tax credits or through encouraging people to have savings accounts. And my question is, if we, as an expert, as people who are sort of working in this policy sphere, whenever we hear about tax credits, our initial reaction is, well, that's not going to change the landscape. That's not really going to help a lot of employers to come up with their own policies. And I just wanted to get the opinion of the group. What do you make of this? To my mind, a confusing finding in the Pew report that employers need to do it. This is something employers need to provide. And yet, we really want this to be voluntary to some extent because we want to do it through tax credits. We don't want to make this a mandate. So what do you make of this sort of, to my mind, sort of conflicting finding in the survey? Harry, do you want to?
Well, to me, as Richard said, the sequence of the questions does affect the response. So if you're not thinking directly about what costs you're imposing, your first gut is like, sure, let employers take care of this. When you start talking more explicitly about how do you do that, and of course, some folks do own small businesses, and these, then they start to think about the cost. And as I said, I do think it's an American thing that a lot of them, they like the benefits. They don't want to bear the cost. The cost should be by someone else. And I think some combination of that, as soon as you think more about the cost, maybe you're reluctant. But I also want to use this, I just want to make one comment. It's a bit of always an elephant in the room, and we wrestled with it in our group. How can the European employers look so massively different on this? People like me who worry about imposing these costs on employers and how they'll react, and it seems like the European countries are really comfortable with 6 months of leave, and the employers, and I'm going to venture a guess that European employers are very, very different from American employers, and the social norms that they've embraced, they much more embrace the social democratic norms that are still very much alive in Europe. I don't perceive those among American employers. I think for a brief time after World War II, for that sort of golden period, at least large companies were more open to that notion. I don't see it now among large companies. I certainly don't see it among small. I think small, medium-sized American employers have this attitude, it's our business, it's my property. The government doesn't have the right to impose these rules and regs on me. And that they react. And if you say, well, but if you just impose it on them, they'll see how good it is and they'll adjust. I don't think that's accurate. Take the example of collective bargaining. The Wagner Act was passed over 80 years ago. American employers still fight it tooth and nail. And those who accepted it, in that golden era now are turning around. And so I just think, I don't think there's a quick way to make American employers be like the European employers. I don't think, like Richard said, I don't think there's an easy way to change these social norms or then to impose it and just think everybody will internalize it. And maybe when that evidence, that mixed evidence kind of reflects the kind of conflict that people feel about imposing costs on business.
That's right. Richard.
So I'd say, I think Harry's right, there's a social contract idea in Europe, but I'd also say that we shouldn't understate the fact that public policy can sometimes shift equilibria and shift social norms. I think you can see that in welfare reform to some extent in the US. And what will typically happen, so happened in the 1970s in the UK, is that employer groups bitterly opposed the introduction of maternity leave, saying that it would disrupt their businesses, small businesses in particular. Was like, there's no way we can cope with it. And then the government at the time just said, we hear you, we're doing it anyway. And on the other side of it, everyone adjusted to it and moved on. And then the same about paternity leave and the same about sick leave. And there's a perfectly reasonable argument to be had there that this will impose costs on us. But actually public policy can create a new equilibrium. Whether that's a good one or bad one, I don't know. But I will say that from a European perspective, one of the things that you used to do is you look across at the US and say, look, not much collective bargaining, very lightly regulated labor market, but boy, look at their growth and their dynamism. And that's a kind of trade-off. So Europe, okay, we're not as dynamic, we don't grow as much, but we're more protected and we've got more. Now, it seems to me the argument's somewhat different. Now, the Europeans are not looking across the Atlantic at the US labor market and going, wow, what an amazing labor market. Now, they're kind of looking at it going, well, actually, it's not that great, and still not that great. So in some ways, I think kind of the argument has changed. If the US was kind of powering away, lots of dynamism, small, fantastic, then you might say, okay, maybe you don't want to do anything that will threaten it. But you might actually, if the US labor market looks a bit more European, maybe US social welfare should look a bit more European as well.
But, I was just going to add that I think that sometimes it's, which came first, the chicken or the egg, and there's cultural changes that are happening that I think, here in Washington, we love to assume that sort of any policies that we impose is what's going to change things. But, the best thing that has happened for women in the workplace, in my view, has been technology. The reason that we're having this conversation on paid leave right now is because I could be off with my third child and say, but I don't have to really disconnect entirely. Maybe I can take a little bit longer as long as I can kind of call in for some of those conference calls, or I can check my email and just not drop, just keep some of the trains running on time. I might not be fully engaged, but it's allowed for sort of this middle ground now, which is something that men are enjoying as well. And we're saying, hey, everyone doesn't have to be in the office all the time to be productive. And guess what? You're not that productive when you sit in an office for 10 hours a day. We've learned that as well. And so I think that technology component is in fact sort of driving so much of this conversation, because people say, I don't even need to be there unless you're, again, this brings it back to the fact that it's really about low income workers who maybe if you're a clerk, you have to be there. but at the high end, if you're a surgeon, you have to be there too. So.
Just a couple points that I want to make, just to piggyback a little bit on what Sabrina was saying. Actually the evidence, if you look at the Families and Work Institute's national study of the employer, that flexibility actually is not really increasing, and that certainly is, there's more unpredictability and chaos for kind of low-wage workers, so that's not something that they experience. I think, kind of going back to your original question, I think one of the things that really strikes me that I don't think we have a real understanding about, you talk about collective bargaining. Again, we don't really talk about that. I don't think workers in the United States understand kind of where they, kind of their kind of like where they sit in terms of, looking internationally even. I mean, you look at productivity rates, after the Second World War, I mean, they've really gone off the charts. And then you look at sort of where wages have been sort of stagnant or flat, depending upon kind of what study you look at. So, the workers have not been reaping the benefits of their labor. You could argue with that increased productivity, there should have been some kind of looking inward or reinvesting in your workforce, whatever R&D or whatever, and that really hasn't happened. There's been much more of a, capital going to the 1%. So I think that there's sort of a larger structural question to be asking here that I don't think that workers are aware of. And then the second point I'd make in terms of thinking that employers need to pay for this, again, in my reporting, even in the states that have paid family leave, a lot of people don't understand that it is a payroll tax. Or a lot of people will say, well, I don't want my taxes to pay for your baby. And they don't understand it's like that they're already doing it, and it's like a 1% tax. So again, I think there's a lot of confusion, because I don't think that we really talk about these issues. Look at major newspapers. Very few have a labor reporter anymore. We don't really talk about, I think there's just a lot of confusion and lack of education out there.
And quickly before I turn to the audience, on the should the policy be very targeted? Even in the Pew survey, I think one of the findings we had that about 26% of workers earning above $75,000 are still not getting paid leave. And then Sabrina, the survey you guys did, you were looking at a slightly higher wage group. It showed an average income of $95,000, and so really like even within sort of different income groups, it doesn't seem to be that everybody is benefiting from having a paid leave program or doing really well with the fact that there's no sort of federal program. And so what are your views on, do we make the program really, really targeted to the very low income, given that they are sort of suffering the worst and have the least cushion to fall back on? Or are we in favor of a slightly more universal policy, like Harry pointed out?
I think it's got to be universal. That's the only way to get buy-in. And then you end up helping the targeted folks, but then you get buy-in from everyone. I think that there's research that shows that public policy that's more universal is more successful.
Universal's a lot more expensive. That's the downside.
Yeah.
But I still agree. I tend to think it should be universal. What we've learned in the last election, if no other time, is that there's a lot of folks above the poverty line who are hurting and who could benefit from some of these policies. I don't think we should ignore them. The benefits to families, to children are universal. I think, and my worry about tax credits is that, which you see in a lot of that often they provide windfalls to companies who will do it anyway, but that the marginal change on behavior will be modest, and it won't be close to. So that's why I think, even though I worry a lot about the costs, I think that would, in the end of the day, be insufficient. I guess.
Sort of ultimately, the best solution, right, to all of this is a robust economy where there's plenty of job competition. So if you're that small percentage at the higher level who's not getting adequate paid leave, You would have, say, I'm going to go to the company across the street because there'd be competition of benefits and wages. That's why I'm much more in favor of a targeted approach, because let's help the people who truly are in need and are falling through the cracks. I think all Americans want to help those people, and that's what our research found, which I thought was tremendously encouraging. Their biggest concern was that a top-down approach and a mandate approach would not help the people that need it the most. And so I'd say target it, and then let's have a government get out of the way so we can have a very strong economy with lots of job creation and competition.
Richard, do you have any?
No.
Okay, great. We'll quickly
Let
open
dads
it.
do it all.
Hi, my name is Tove Bjørgaas. I'm a journalist from Norway. Very interesting to listen to you guys. We have a pretty generous system that is working well. It has its problems. We still have a lot of women in part-time jobs. It might be too generous. Your slide should show Norwegian men take very short leave with full pay because there's a law that says you have to take 6 weeks. But some, like the left, wants to increase that. My question is, I guess that's a $1 million question, how to move forward in America. I mean, how do you do this? Do you do it the way Obama started with climate policy, sort of by pushing it along through maybe executive orders and then having private business follow along, and then at some point it's gotten so far that like everyone has to come on board, or do you do it through Congress? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how far we've gotten at this point. I think another point that is very different in at least my part of Europe and the US are, of course, the hours that people put in. We have a very regulated labor market. Most families work from like 8 to 4:30, and then they pick up their children from heavily subsidized, actually mandated daycare that costs about $300 a month per child from age 1 until they start school at age 6. And I think if you don't have anything like that, I mean, with like you were showing the cost of nannies, for instance, I mean, people might have to go back out of the labor market just to pay for. I meet moms here all the time who say they can't afford to pay for childcare. But my general question is just where do we move from here, and how far have we gotten, say, in the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, yeah, I would just say, there has been the Family Act sort of on the Democratic side that's been introduced for several years in Congress, hasn't really had a lot of movement. There's been sort of the Healthy Families Act on the Republican side, also not a whole lot of movement. There is more probably discussion. What the Obama administration did was have a fund to grant states, to give states the ability to investigate how to create their own state-paid family leave systems. And Vicki Shabo's here, she's been tracking a lot of that. That's probably where the most policy action has been in recent years, is on the state level. And that's actually what happened with the Unpaid Family Medical Leave Act that actually went through several states until it reached sort of a critical mass. And that happens, sort of, it was more like, well, why are we having all these little different policies? Let's have like one national policy. So that's one potential route forward, is continuing movement at the state level.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, given the polarization now. So the Trump campaign did embrace a policy. It was far less generous, closer, I think, to some of the things Bridget had talked about. It's possible. Oh, you're right. Sabrina, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's possible that could come out of this Congress. I'm skeptical. In fact, if you look at the debacle over ACA, the fact that Republicans will coalesce around that seems very unlikely to me. So what you're probably going to have is the states moving ahead. I think what I would like to see is the red states starting to do. I mean, I'm worried about this massive gulf between the red and the blue states. So my hope is that some of the red states would start to do some of what you said. Maybe starting with tax credits, maybe starting with voluntary savings accounts, and then maybe the notion that this is a positive thing will take hold there, and the notion that federal or state policy should do something to even encourage more of it. So that would be my best hope. Whether in the current polarized environment, to me, it's not enough. I would prefer to see something broader, but that might be the most realistic.
Question then.
Across all 4 speakers,
Excuse me.
across all four speakers, every country you mentioned and every state that you have mentioned, except Iceland, has a lower fertility rate than for the non-Hispanic whites in the United States. Has anyone done an analysis to show that all these policies basically discourage the upper classes from having children?
I don't think that that's true on the fertility rate. I don't have the data.
Bulgaria is 1.3. If they've got the best Family Leave Act.
Oh, I don't think they do.
One of the lowest fertility rates.
No, I don't. I don't think that they do have the best leave. They have the longest, but I don't think that that's the best. I don't think it's working particularly well. The U.S. rate, my understanding.
California has the second lowest fertility rate in the United States for non-Hispanic white females, and they've had family leave since 2004. It seems like adding all the cost of doing business and all the taxes discourages upper middle class people from having children.
You can't necessarily infer a causal effect there. Right? It might just be that you have a lot of professional women that have selected to live in California, and professional women do choose to have fewer kids. So you can't. I just think you're making a big causal leap.
Well, and the other thing I would say, like in terms of the impact on you just look at people feeling stressed and overwhelmed and feeling like they don't have enough time. I would say that has an awful lot more to do with our work culture. That we do value these long hours. That's one thing that you will see that in the European countries, it's not only do they have regulated, shorter hours, but there's also the feeling that if you work long hours there, you're not a better worker, which is the feeling here, but you're actually inefficient. So I would argue that probably has and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but that seems, at least anecdotally, to have an awful lot to do with why people do or do not choose to have children. The child care is wildly expensive, and then you have to work insane hours. So we don't really set it up culturally or structurally very family friendly in this country either.
Okay.
Thank you for the panelists. My name is Li Yang. I think go back to the point that I try to put something is compare the policies and the practice. Second is compare the household production in a sense. Whether you have analysis by demographic or by occupation, maybe some segment of those parents are maybe more knowledgeable or more concerned about health care. They know how to deal with the children or their babies rather than wait until the problem, until sickness, then you have to see the doctor and take more leaves. Second is for the policy and practice sense. I wonder if you have analysis whether you, in the policy sense, they do have this policy for leave, but in practical sense, employer deny your leaves. And then whether you can one step further to follow up those maybe complain about the denial of leaves, how do they process, and where do you find a record to analyze it?
I'll just say briefly on that. So the point, if it's a law, then in theory they can't deny it to you. But you're right that people are still afraid, and it came out of the Pew Research, I think, which is that, and just because a law is passed doesn't necessarily mean the fear won't still be there, and the kind of social norms around it. So I think that's real. I would say on the household production point that the goal here should be to try and allow maximum choice and flexibility to do the kind of household production, how you're going to balance it between yourselves as flexibly as possible. And I think that does include leave, but it also includes fair scheduling. Massive lack of certainty. Like 40% of hourly paid workers in the key age demographic don't know their weekly schedule a week out. And the variation's up to 49%. How do you do household production? How do you raise kids when you don't know when you're going to be working 10 days from now, right? And that is not a problem for us. That is not a problem for the people we've been talking about. That's the problem there. So I think scheduling and time, all of that, because otherwise the fear that a lot of us have had is that rather than trying to create family-friendly work, we end up creating work-friendly families. And what we're really trying to do is just maximize economic production from women as well as men now, And actually, that's completely the wrong way around. It should be about, it seems to me that particularly the results of the surveys reinforces. People want to raise their kids. They want to share it between them. And so we want to try and create a labour market that allows them to do that, rather than assuming this kind of Stakhanovite view, which is just, hey, men have been working 50 hours a week for forever. Let's all do that. Wouldn't that be amazing? That's not what people want. It's not what my generation of men want, let alone what women want.
I think that there's, because I agree with everything you're saying, and at the same time, I think that we can easily sort of fall down this rabbit hole of sort of this domino effect of regulations, right? So, I mean, there's trade-offs to all of these. If you start regulating schedules, then a restaurant that says, wow, there's going to be a snowstorm, I want to have more people on staff, and guess what? There's a lot of workers who want those extra hours. And so I think we have to just have a very light touch on the workplace, because I think it makes us feel good and it sounds good and it makes us think that people are going to be able to raise their families better, but it's not always that black or white. I just think that there's the person who wants to pick up the extra shift because they have, they want to send their kid to camp. That matters too. And so it's just it's not perfect. I'm not ignoring that. I'm frequently overwhelmed and running around like a chicken with my head cut off. But I do think that there's for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, and we too often sort of overlook that. And with the workplace, it can just kind of spiral out of control.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Please join me in a round of applause. And thank you all for coming.